So picture this. I'm standing in front of this insanely picturesque waterfall on the edge of a hiking trail in Costa Rica, trying to get the perfect vacation shot. You know the kind. Arms outstretched, like I'm embracing the whole world while the water crashes behind me. I'm there, probably looking way too posed for what was supposed to be a chill solo trip. And then, out of nowhere, this guy bursts into the frame, mid-leap like some kind of action hero photobomb. At first, I was annoyed. Like, seriously? Could you pick a more awkward moment? But then, as I lowered the camera to glare at him, I noticed he wasn't just some random tourist messing around. He was grinning, this easy, genuine smile that somehow made the whole thing way less irritating. He had wind-blown dark hair, a messy beard, and eyes that looked like they'd seen a few too many sunrises. Honestly, it was the kind of smile that makes you wonder if someone's about to say something interesting. He caught me looking and held up a peace sign like he knew he'd just crashed my vacation vibe. I was mid-snap and, well, I didn't have much time to react, except to laugh. Because what else do you do when a stranger photobombs you at your most Instagram-worthy moment? So, I lowered my camera, still chuckling, and asked, "Seriously, man? Couldn't wait until after the photo?" That's when he said something that flipped the whole day around. "Sorry, I'm Dan. Thought I'd make your solo trip a little less solo." That line stuck with me. It wasn't cheesy or over the top. It was just casual, like a genuine offer rather than some pickup line. At that moment, I realized my carefully planned solo vacation probably wasn't going to be as solo as I thought. Now, don't get me wrong. I didn't just hand over my heart right then and there. I mean, come on, I was supposed to be on vacation, unplugged and recharging, not getting pulled into some spontaneous rom-com scene. But Dan, he had this way of making the jungle heat feel like a backdrop instead of the main event. And yeah, the way he photobombed my picture was just the start of something I wasn't ready for but couldn't turn away from either. So imagine me, standing there dripping wet from the mist of the falls, camera in one hand, stranger turned interest in the other, wondering how the hell a simple vacation pic got hijacked, and where this unexpected detour might take me next. I wiped the water off my face and looked at Dan, still grinning like he'd just pulled off the best prank of the day. I tried to play it cool, but honestly, I was curious. "All right, Dan, what exactly does making my solo trip less solo look like?" He shrugged, like it was the simplest thing in the world. "Well, I'm here for a few more days. I'm staying at that hostel over there." He pointed to a slightly run-down building perched near the trailhead. "If you want, maybe we could grab a beer later? Talk about how you tried to get the perfect shot and I ruined it." I thought about it for a second. Usually, I keep to myself on trips like this, but there was something about him. Something that made the idea less intimidating. Plus, sharing a beer in a place I barely knew might actually be fun. "Sure," I said, smiling. "Why not? It's a vacation. Might as well make it interesting." We headed back down the trail together, swapping stories as we walked. Dan was from a small town in Oregon, an artist by trade, traveling to gather inspiration for his next project. His easygoing vibe was contagious. He made me feel like I'd known him longer than a few minutes. I told him about my job as a graphic designer, how I'd needed this trip to escape the grind and reconnect with myself. The kind of stuff you don't usually admit to strangers, but somehow spills out when you're halfway up a mountain. When we got to the hostel, it was exactly what you'd expect from a budget place in the middle of nowhere. Creaky floors, mismatched furniture, and the faint smell of sunscreen and wet socks. Dan led me to a small bar area where a handful of other travelers were scattered around, nursing drinks or swapping stories. He ordered us each a local craft beer, the kind brewed with passion but served with zero pretension. We sat at a rickety table near a window overlooking the jungle, the fading sunlight casting long shadows across the room. As we talked, I started noticing little things. The way Dan's eyes lit up when he described a painting he was working on, how he laughed so freely when I made a sarcastic joke about my own lack of adventure skills, and how comfortable it felt to just sit there with him without the usual awkwardness that comes with new people. At some point, the conversation turned to past relationships, and I found myself opening up about the difficulty of balancing work, family expectations, and the fear of putting myself out there. Dan listened, not saying much, just nodding, and offering a quiet kind of understanding that was rare. When I finally asked him about his own love life, he shrugged and said, "Nothing serious. Traveling helps me figure out who I am. Meeting new people, like you, makes it harder to feel lonely though." That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a chance encounter. There was something subtly magnetic about Dan, an unspoken invitation to break whatever rules I'd set for myself about vacations, about love, about being vulnerable. We stayed out later than I expected, wandering through the small town streets under a canopy of stars, the night alive with the sound of distant music and the soft rustle of palm leaves. At one point, Dan slipped his hand into mine, not in a flashy, dramatic way, but just enough to make my skin buzz with a kind of quiet electricity. I didn't pull away. Instead, I squeezed his hand back, feeling like maybe this trip was no longer about escaping, but about discovering something I didn't even know I was looking for. By the time we returned to the hostel, the idea of me continuing this vacation alone felt strange, almost impossible. Somehow, this photobomber had flipped the script, turning my solitary adventure into a story I wanted to keep writing. And yeah, I still have no idea how a random leap into a vacation photo led to this, but I'm glad it did. The thing about that night was how normal it felt, even though everything about it was anything but. We didn't rush into anything or try to force a connection. We just existed in that space between strangers and something more. With the jungle whispering outside our windows and the distant hum of night insects filling the silence between our words, I remember sitting on the creaky balcony of the hostel, the humid air sticking to my skin, as Dan pulled out a sketch pad and started doodling. I didn't really know what to expect, but watching him sketch was mesmerizing. His lines were loose, but deliberate, like he was capturing something that only he could see. Every so often, he'd glance up at me and smile, like he was sharing a secret without saying a word. Eventually, I asked, "What are you drawing?" He didn't look up right away, just kept his pencil moving. "You," he said quietly. I laughed, surprised. "Me? How?" He shrugged, still sketching. "You're the most interesting thing I've seen all day, besides that waterfall, obviously." He grinned, and I felt my cheeks warm. That night, we ended up talking until the early hours, swapping stories about our childhoods, dreams we'd buried, and the weird little quirks that made us who we are. Dan told me about growing up in Oregon with two older sisters who constantly teased him, and how art was his escape. I shared how I'd always been the reliable one in my family, the guy who had to have everything together, even when he didn't. There was something comforting in the way we shared these things. No judgment, no pressure, just a real conversation between two people who happened to cross paths halfway across the world. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of rain tapping against the window. I was still half dreaming when Dan knocked on my door, holding 2 mugs of coffee and that same easy smile. "Thought you might need this," he said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. We sat on the floor of my room, backs against the wall, watching the rain wash over the jungle canopy. The storm made the world feel quieter, more intimate. In that moment, I realized how much I'd been craving connection. Not just physical, but something deeper, something that made me feel seen. After a while, Dan turned to me and said, "What if we explored a little more together? Not just this town, but the whole area? I'm here for another week." My heart skipped. I wanted to say yes, but hesitated. I'd come on this trip to be alone, to figure myself out without distractions. Yet the idea of wandering through new places with him, sharing experiences instead of solo selfies, sounded a lot better than I expected. "I'm in," I said finally, surprising myself. That day, as the rain cleared, we set off on a trail winding through the rainforest, the path slippery but exhilarating. We joked about who was the better hiker. Who was definitely not, and took turns snapping pictures of waterfalls, exotic plants, and each other. Dan was relentless with the camera, always trying to catch candid moments, which made me laugh and feel more alive. At one point, we stopped by a small river, its crystal clear water inviting enough to dip our feet in. We sat side by side on a rock, the cold water shocking but refreshing. Dan glanced at me, and this time, the smile wasn't just friendly. It was something softer, more deliberate. "Funny how one little photobomb can change everything," he said quietly. I nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle over me. "Yeah, I guess some accidents are the best kind." We didn't rush to define what was happening between us. It was enough to just be there, together, exploring the unknown. But beneath the surface, I felt a stirring, a hope that maybe, just maybe, this trip was the start of something real. By the time evening rolled around, we found ourselves back at the hostel, exhausted but exhilarated. The night was alive with laughter and music from the common room, and Dan pulled me into the crowd like he wanted me to forget all the worries I'd brought with me. Later, as the party died down, we ended up on the balcony again, the stars blazing overhead. Without thinking too much, I leaned into him, and he didn't pull away. Our first kiss was tentative but electric, a quiet promise beneath the vast sky. I never imagined a photobomb could lead to this, a connection that felt honest and unexpected. But sitting there with Dan, feeling his hand in mine, I knew one thing for sure. Sometimes, the best moments happen when you let go of the plan and just embrace the chaos. That kiss lingered between us like a fragile thread, something new and unspoken but full of possibility. We didn't say much afterward, just sat side by side, hands still entwined, watching the shadows dance beneath the stars. There was no rush, no pressure to explain or label what was happening. At that moment, it felt like the world had shrunk to just the two of us and the gentle night air. The next morning, I woke up with this fuzzy mix of excitement and nervousness swirling in my stomach. It was strange how one night could change everything so quickly. I wasn't just on vacation anymore. I was navigating something unexpected, something real. Over breakfast at a small cafe by the beach, Dan and I fell into an easy rhythm. We ordered strong coffee and shared a plate of fresh fruit, the kind that tasted like sunshine. He talked about his favorite artists, the kind of music that fueled his creativity, and even gave me a crash course on sketching. I tried to imitate his strokes, but my attempts looked more like angry scribbles than art. He laughed, but it was gentle, encouraging. "So when's the last time you did something just for fun?" he asked, eyes sparkling. I thought about it. Work had consumed most of my time lately, and even the vacation had been planned like a checklist. "Honestly, I can't remember," I admitted. Dan shook his head with mock disappointment. "Well, we'll fix that." That day, we rented bikes and explored the coastline, the wind whipping through our hair and the ocean stretching endlessly beside us. There was something freeing about racing down empty roads, laughing when one of us swerved too close to the edge. I felt lighter than I had in months, like the weight of expectations and failed plans was finally lifting. As the sun began to dip, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange, we stopped at a secluded beach. The waves were calm, and the sand was still warm from the day. Dan pulled out his sketch pad and started drawing again, this time capturing the horizon where the sea met the sky. I sat beside him, watching the colors shift and fade. After a while, I found myself opening up about my fears, how I'd always worried that if I let my guard down, I'd get hurt. How I'd built walls so high that sometimes even I struggled to climb out. Dan listened without interrupting, his gaze steady and kind. When I finished, he said, "Maybe it's not about tearing down the walls all at once. Maybe it's about letting someone in, one brick at a time." His words stayed with me long after the sun disappeared below the waterline. I realized that with Dan, I didn't feel the need to be perfect or guarded. I could just be me, flaws, fears, and all. And that was enough. The next few days blurred into a beautiful routine. Morning hikes, afternoon swims, evenings filled with music and conversation. We became this little team, exploring hidden waterfalls, trying local dishes that left our mouths burning, and sharing stories that revealed more about who we were beneath the surface. One afternoon, on a trail lined with wild orchids, Dan stopped suddenly and looked at me with that serious expression I hadn't seen before. "Hey," he said softly. "I know this trip wasn't supposed to be about meeting anyone, but I'm really glad we met." I smiled, feeling my heart beat a little faster. Me too. He reached out, brushing a stray strand of hair from my face. I don't want this to end when we go back home. The thought hit me like a punch. I hadn't really considered what would happen afterward. This felt so immediate, so present, that the idea of leaving it behind was almost unbearable. Yeah, I said, voice barely above a whisper. I don't want that either. For the first time, the future felt less scary and more like an adventure waiting to happen, one we might get to share. Of course, reality was still looming. I had a job, responsibilities, a life back home that wasn't going to pause just because I'd fallen for someone on the other side of the world. But with Dan, it felt possible to imagine a different kind of story, one where we tried, where we fought for something real. That night, as we lay tangled together under the thin, hostile blanket, I realized something important. Maybe photobombs aren't just interruptions. Sometimes they're invitations. Messy, unexpected, and perfectly timed. And maybe, just maybe, that's exactly what I needed. The days that followed were a whirlwind of small moments that somehow felt huge. We were still on vacation, but the line between travel companions and something more blurred every time our hands brushed or our eyes met across a crowded room. I kept thinking about how surreal it was. Just a few days ago, Dan was a random photobomber, and now he was the guy whose presence made the whole trip brighter. One morning, after a slow breakfast of papaya and strong coffee, Dan suggested we visit a nearby village known for its artisan crafts. I was hesitant. I'm not exactly an artsy guy, but Dan's enthusiasm was contagious. As we wandered through the colorful stalls, Dan stopped at a tiny shop filled with hand-woven textiles and intricate woodwork. He knelt down to inspect a carved wooden mask while I watched him, admiring how easily he fell into his element. "Hey," he said without looking up, "want to help me pick something for my parents?" I smiled. "Sure, as long as they like weird souvenirs." He laughed and pulled me close. "Trust me, they'll love it." We spent the morning browsing and bargaining with the shopkeepers. Dan's Spanish was better than mine, so he did most of the talking. I mostly tagged along, secretly enjoying the way his eyes lit up when he found something special. Later, as we sat on a bench watching kids play soccer in the dusty street, I felt this weird mix of happiness and nervousness. Dan was easy to be around, but that made the what-if questions harder to ignore. What happens when this trip ends? Will we just go back to our separate lives? I finally voiced it. So, what happens when you head back to Oregon and I fly home to New York? Dan shrugged, but there was a flicker of seriousness in his eyes. I don't know. I guess we figure it out. Maybe keep talking. See where it goes? Long distance? I asked, raising an eyebrow. Yeah, he said with a grin. I mean, it sounds scary, but maybe it's worth a shot. For once, I didn't scoff or make a joke to deflect. I wanted to believe in that possibility, even if it felt fragile. We kept walking, the sun warming our backs, and I realized I was grafting new hopes onto old fears. That afternoon, back at the hostel, Dan pulled out his sketch pad again. I sat beside him, watching as he sketched a scene of the waterfall where we'd first met. The lines were soft and fluid, capturing the movement of the water and the wildness of the jungle. "Looks amazing," I told him. He shrugged, but there was pride there. "You're part of the story now," I smiled, feeling a little lump in my throat. As the evening came, we joined the other travelers for dinner around a long, shared table. The atmosphere was lively, stories exchanged, laughter echoing under strings of fairy lights. Dan and I ended up side by side, occasionally stealing glances, sharing quiet smiles. Later, when the party moved to the hostel's small courtyard, I noticed Dan talking to a group of people, animated and confident. It hit me how much I liked seeing that side of him, the one that thrived in the spotlight, the one I hadn't quite gotten to know until now. When he finally caught my eye, he beckoned me over with that playful grin. "Come join us." I hesitated briefly, but followed, realizing I didn't want to miss a beat of this adventure. Later, as the night deepened, Dan pulled me aside and said, "Want to see a secret spot?" Curious, I nodded, and we slipped away from the crowd into the cool night air. He led me through a narrow alley and up a flight of stairs to a rooftop terrace. The view was breathtaking. The village below twinkled with tiny lights, and the stars stretched endlessly above. We sat side by side, the silence between us comfortable and filled with unspoken words. "I'm really glad you let me photobomb your trip," Dan said softly. I laughed. Me too. Then, without thinking much, I reached out and took his hand. His fingers curled around mine, warm and steady. We sat there for a long time, just holding hands and watching the night sky, both knowing this was one of those moments you don't forget. But as the night wore on, the reality of leaving came creeping back. I asked, "Do you think this is something people actually make work? Long distance, I mean." Dan squeezed my hand. "I think it depends on the people. And I'm willing to try if you are." I met his gaze and saw something honest and hopeful that made me believe he meant it. That night, back in my room, I lay awake thinking about how much my trip had changed. What started as a solo escape had turned into a story I never expected. A story with a guy who jumped into my photo and into my life. I wasn't sure where this would go, but for the first time in a long while, I wasn't afraid to find out. The next morning, the sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, and I found myself staring at the ceiling, replaying everything from the night before. It felt surreal, how fast things had changed, how natural it all seemed, despite the whirlwind of emotions. I wasn't the kind of guy to get swept away easily, but with Dan, it felt different. Like maybe, just maybe, I could take a chance. I got up, stretched, and headed out to grab breakfast, hoping a bit of fresh air would clear my head. As I wandered toward the cafe, I spotted Dan already sitting at a small table, sipping coffee and flipping through his sketch pad. When he saw me, his face lit up, and I couldn't help but smile back. "Morning," he said, patting the seat next to him. I sat down, the warmth of the coffee matching the warmth I felt just being near him. "So," Dan started, "what's the plan for today? More exploring? Or are you ready for a little lazy beach time?" I laughed. "I'm thinking lazy beach sounds pretty good. My knees could use a break from all that hiking." He grinned. "Perfect. I know just the spot." We spent the morning biking down a dirt road lined with coconut palms, the air thick with the smell of salt and earth. The beach Dan took me to was the kind of place that felt like a secret. Secluded, untouched, with soft white sand and turquoise waves that rolled in gently. We dropped our bikes near a cluster of cashew trees and made our way down to the water. The sun was warm but not oppressive, the kind of perfect beach day you don't want to end. We sprawled out on a blanket, soaking in the sun and the sound of the ocean. At some point, Dan pulled his sketch pad out again and started drawing the waves, the way the sunlight hit the water. I watched him, fascinated by how he captured the world through his eyes. "Ever thought about doing this professionally?" I asked. He shrugged. "I'm trying to. It's not easy, but moments like this make it feel worth it." I nodded. "I get that. I work in design, but sometimes it feels like I'm just going through the motions." He looked up, meeting my gaze. "Maybe you need a change of scenery, or a partner in crime to shake things up." My heart skipped, and I smiled. I liked the sound of that. We spent hours talking, laughing, and just being. At one point, Dan suggested we take a swim, and before I knew it, we were splashing around in the warm water, the kind of carefree fun I hadn't had in years. As the day turned to evening, we built a small fire on the beach and sat close, the flames flickering against the growing darkness. Dan pulled me into a hug that felt both comforting and electric. "I don't want this to end," I admitted quietly. "Neither do I," he whispered back. The truth was, neither of us knew exactly what we were getting into, but the idea of going back to our separate lives without trying felt impossible. Back at the hostel that night, the reality of the coming days settled in. My flight home was only a few days away, and Dan had plans to continue traveling for a bit longer. We talked honestly about the challenges ahead, the time zones, the distance, the uncertainty, but instead of fear, there was hope. Hope that this unexpected connection wasn't just a vacation fling, but something more. On our last full day together, we woke early to catch the sunrise from a nearby cliff. The sky exploded in colors, pink, orange, purple, and as we stood side by side, The world felt infinite. Dan turned to me, eyes bright. "Want to make a promise?" I raised an eyebrow. "What kind of promise?" "That we'll try. That we'll keep this alive no matter how hard it gets." I took his hand, feeling the weight and warmth of it. "I promise." We sealed it with a kiss, simple but full of everything we couldn't say aloud. The next morning, packing my bags was harder than I expected. The thought of leaving Dan, leaving this place, this feeling, was like a punch to the gut. At the airport, we hugged tight, neither wanting to let go. "See you soon?" Dan asked, voice hopeful. "Definitely," I replied. As I watched him disappear into the crowd, I knew this was just the beginning. The photobomb that started it all wasn't a random accident. It was fate crashing into my life when I least expected it. And for once, I was ready to follow where it led. The weeks after I got home were a blur of texts, late-night calls, and planning visits. It wasn't always easy. Time zones meant some conversations happened at odd hours, and there were days when the distance felt overwhelming. But somehow, every message from Dan reminded me why I'd made that promise on the cliff overlooking the sunrise. We weren't perfect. There were moments of doubt, moments where I questioned if this was sustainable. But what kept us going was the honesty, the little things, sharing a playlist, sending photos of everyday life, the way his voice would brighten my day even through a crackling phone line. A couple of months later, Dan surprised me by flying out to New York. Seeing him step off the plane, grinning, that same easy smile, was like the world suddenly made sense again. We spent those few days exploring the city together, laughing at how different our worlds were, but finding comfort in the space we carved out. That trip wasn't about grand gestures or romantic cliches. It was about real moments. Walking through Central Park, grabbing coffee in tiny cafes, just being two guys figuring out how to make this work. In those moments, I realized that what started as a photobomb had grown into something steady, something worth fighting for. Now, months later, we're planning our next trip, somewhere new, somewhere that will be another chapter in our story. We still have our challenges, but the way I see it, any relationship worth having will. What matters is that we're willing to show up, to keep trying, and to be honest with each other. Looking back, I never expected a random photobomb to change my life, but sometimes the best things come from the unexpected, the unplanned, the moments when you let go and let life surprise you. And honestly, I'm grateful for that leap, for that smile, for the guy who crashed my vacation photo and then asked me out. Because it taught me that sometimes love finds you when you're not looking, and it's worth taking the chance.